Welcome to the final of our videos in the early modern and modern era of Britain. And in this era, we're going to look at the Victorian period. So the Victorian era lasted roughly from 1820 to 1914, and it was defined by the rule of Queen Victoria, although not as specifically as were the eras of the Tudors and the Stuarts. It was in many ways Britain's golden era. The British Empire was at its full power, becoming the largest empire in human history. And at its peak, it had over 400 million people as subjects, from India all the way to Canada. So as we mentioned earlier, Britain is well known for its culture of social classes. And this culture had unique expressions during the Victorian era that are worth looking into. The upper classes, as we mentioned in previous videos, usually inherited their wealth and they owned land. So men in the upper class could vote, and few in this class ever did work, at least not compared to the working classes. The working classes made up the great majority of British society. They did the physical labor, and their hard work and their toughness was the basis of really Britain's power and prosperity. Working class people mostly couldn't vote since they couldn't afford to own property. So these hard facts contributed to a kind of class divide. In the Victorian era, there was also a middle class, and these were the people who had gained wealth and social status, but crucially, not via inheritance or titles like their upper class counterparts. So a typical member of the Victorian middle class would have maybe been a merchant or a doctor or a lawyer. Middle class children would have attended school, and their fathers would have usually been eligible to vote because they have owned property. It is interesting to note that Britain's more advanced colonies didn't usually copy this class system. And this is mainly because the class system is inherently tied to the patterns of British history, as we've seen previously. So therefore, the system of social class is really part of what makes Britain's culture unique amongst English-speaking nations. So a particularly serious issue that was confronted during the Victorian era was that of the slave trade in the Atlantic. So Great Britain itself abolished the Atlantic slave trade in the early 19th century. And it used the great might of the Royal Navy to enforce that ban. So what this meant was when Royal Navy ships caught slavers attempting to transport slaves from, let's say, Africa to the Americas, they would force the ships to return to their last port, and they would release their captives. Okay, so let's move on to a topic that we've mentioned in passing, the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is crucial to modern British history, and it's important that it began in the cities of this island. So in terms of the ways that it has changed the way we live, it is really only comparable to the appearance of agriculture thousands of years ago. Increasingly, global trade led by Britain actually made this revolution possible. So the Industrial Revolution was a unique event, and it can be said that industrialization required 6 factors in order to take place. So those 6 factors are as follows. You needed 1, high levels of agricultural production, and 2, you need people with managerial skills. 3, you need a means of transportation for raw materials and goods, such as ports, rivers, canals, and roads. Fourth, you would need the natural resources themselves, such as coal and iron. Fifth, you need a legal environment that can foster business and maintain the peace. Six, finally, of course, you would need the capital, you would need the money to invest in industrial enterprises. So uniquely around the world, Britain met these criteria, and really it kind of changed the modern world completely. So examples of this kind of new industry included the steam engine, textile mills, large scales metallurgy, and various kinds of machinery and tools. The so-called cottage industries of the past were largely wiped out. So this is industries where people worked from their homes, things like weaving, and the era of the factory would dominate. So we're talking really about the creation of the modern capitalist system. So standards of living increased under capitalism, but social change and the cultural weakening had also been seen and were quite severe. So now on to our final topic, the British Empire. The British Empire can be roughly defined as any part of the world that was under the political or the military control of Great Britain. So the British Empire took control and ruled through two different forms. One was imperialism and the other was colonialism. And there are important differences between the two. So typically, imperialism is defined as a state policy of domination over another population and land using diplomacy or armed force. On the other hand, colonialism usually involves the moving and the settling of people from the dominant country to the subject country. So in this case, people from the British Empire would actually live in those countries. So imperialism and colonialism were basically motivated by a desire for resources and wealth. Technological advancements in Europe, especially with regards to maritime technology, technology relating to boats and navigation, made it possible for Europeans to confront faraway peoples with the advantage always on their side. So this kind of imperialism and colonialism were often justified to the people under the guise of spreading religion, spreading Christianity around the globe. The British Empire specifically had two main phases of colonialism and imperialism. In the first, Britain wrestled control over major colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and the Indian subcontinent. So this allowed them to vastly expand raw material resources and trade back to Great Britain. In the second phase, the British Empire expanded into Africa and East Asia and Australia. So we mentioned before the loss of the 13 colonies in what is now America. And this motivated the colonization of Australia and eventually Singapore, Hong Kong, and African territories like Nigeria and Kenya. Slavery initially played a huge role in these earlier phases of the empire, but as we noted earlier, it was actually banned fairly soon after. So the vast and powerful empires of Europe would be brought down in two stages. The first stage was World War I, and this saw the great European empires basically destroy each other. Prior to World War I, Europeans, and especially Britons, had a strong faith in their culture and heritage. And after World War I, this began to change. World War I also put a tremendous strain on the economies of Europe. Colonies such as South Africa, Canada, and other British Empire colonies began to want independence themselves. The second phase was World War II. So World War II, I guess we could describe as the knockout blow, the final blow to the European empires. Hitler's armies had the Western allies pinned down in Europe, and this led them unable to defend their Asian colonies from the Japanese. And this massive and brutal conflict led to the economic decline of all the empires, especially the British Empire. So Britain, once the wealthiest and the most powerful empire in history, saw virtually all of her colonies achieve independence within the next 20 years.